It was July 30th, 1944, and British Churchill tanks rolling through Normandy were about to meet a new German tank destroyer. Tightly packed Churchills were advancing through thick terrain, perfectly suited for ambushes, when three vehicles they had never seen before emerged just 400 yards ahead of them. Executing a perfect ambush, in just a couple of minutes, 11 Churchill tanks were burning. The attackers retreated without any losses, but one vehicle broke down and was left behind almost intact. Later that day, British forces would find out what had devastated their armoured column and see the Jagdpanther for the first time. This is the story of the heavy tank destroyer that wreaked havoc on Allied tankers, yet most of the time it was its own crew who destroyed it, and now you'll see why. Let's begin. So how and why was the Jagdpanther born? It all started when the Germans were trying to mount the new Pak-43 L-71 gun on a tank platform. The Tiger II was using it very effectively, and it was one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war. But Tiger II was simply too expensive and complicated to build in large numbers. The turretless tank destroyer concept, on the other hand, proved much more cost-effective. The Pak-43 was an improved version of the famous 88 that the Tiger I had. It fired the same projectile but with a longer barrel and a bigger cartridge, giving it extreme muzzle velocity. For comparison, the Tiger I's 88 could penetrate 120 millimeters of 60 degrees sloped armor at 100 meters, which was already more than enough to make the Tiger a feared tank. Under the same conditions, however, the new 88 could go through 202 millimeters of armor. But the real difference comes at long range, where at 2,000 meters, the older 88's penetration drops to 84 millimeters, while the new one could go through 132. So to put it simply, the new gun could penetrate more armor at 2,000 meters than the older one could at just 100 meters. And with new heavy Allied tanks emerging like the Soviet IS-2, the Germans wanted to mount this great gun onto a tank chassis and turn it into a designated tank killer. However, finding the right platform was not an easy task. It was first tried with the Nashorn, which worked quite well with the gun but had thin armor and a high silhouette, making it too vulnerable. Then, the Ferdinand overcompensated for this with its massive 70 tons and 200 millimeters of armor, but it was ultimately impractical, being notoriously slow, unreliable, and too heavy to cross most bridges. The Hetzer, Stug, and Jagdpanzer IV were great destroyers/assault guns for mass production, but with thin armor and 7.5 centimeter guns in their most powerful configuration, they were already outdated. Now the Germans needed to combine all the best traits of these vehicles into one new tank destroyer. When trying to mount the Pak-43 onto a Panther chassis, they were surprised by how well it matched. The Panther was already a proven tank, and a fixed armored casemate was easily welded onto its hull. In short, after trials, errors, and refinements, the new heavy tank destroyer was born under the name Sonderkraftfahrzeug 173, meaning Special Purpose Vehicle 173, but it became better known as the Jagdpanther, or Hunter Panther in German. Production began in January 1944, but was constantly harassed by Allied strategic bombings. By mid-1944, only 46 Jagdpanthers had been made, which was far from the goal of 160 units per month. Production continued despite the lack of workers and resources, completing only 415 Jagdpanthers by the end of the war. However, despite their small numbers, they were about to achieve a horrific kill-to-loss ratio when put against advancing Allied tanks, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's first explain what exactly set the Jagdpanther apart from other tank destroyers. The first was the gun we mentioned, with an extreme muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, capable of destroying any tank the Allies had at ranges over 3,000 meters. Its frontal 80mm armor plate was sloped at 55 degrees, giving it serious protection from direct fire, especially at the range it was intended to operate. The sides and rear were 50mm thick and sloped at 60 degrees, also providing solid protection, while the roof and floor ranged from just 16 to 25mm, making it vulnerable to mines or artillery. A MG-34 mounted in the front right was manned by the radio operator, serving as protection against enemy infantry. Beside him were the commander, driver, gunner, and loader. The superstructure looked spacious from the outside, but inside, the massive gun breech, 60 shells, and 5 crew members were tightly packed together. Without a turret, the gun was in a fixed position with traverse limited to just 12 degrees left or right. However, since it was designed as a long-range tank killer, this traverse still allowed it to cover a 1-kilometer-wide field of fire at 2,000 meters. The Maybach high-performance V12 gasoline engine gave the 46-ton destroyer a top speed of 28 miles per hour, 46 kilometers per hour, even matching the mobility of the significantly lighter and less armored Sherman. However, reliability was another story. It was one of the most complex and modern machines of its time, and if not careful, the driver could easily destroy the Jagdpanther's fragile final drives, which happened quite often, especially when you add combat stress to a hastily trained 18-year-old conscript who had never driven a car before. Visibility and situational awareness inside the Jagdpanther were another issue. The commander had to lead the vehicle while sticking half of his body out of the hull to sea, and he also had to assist the loader in handling the 50-pound shells for the main gun. Now, we need to understand how the Jagdpanther was meant to be used in combat. As Germany shifted to a defensive war, the Jagdpanther was meant to operate in specialized heavy tank destroyer battalions tasked with breaking Allied tank attacks from long range. They were positioned defensively behind the main force to maximize their range advantage, and using them alone without proper flank protection from infantry and tanks was strictly forbidden. However, as the war turned against Germany, they were eventually forced into roles they weren't designed for, like urban and close quarters combat. As we mentioned, they were deployed in Normandy in bocage terrain, where fighting was at close range. They often fought in small squads, or even alone without infantry protection. They had to constantly change positions to avoid counterfire from Allied artillery or attack aircraft and watch for bazooka teams trying to ambush them. The Allies quickly learned that the best way to deal with them was not to attack head-on with tanks, but rather to relay their position to artillery or attack aircraft and wait. However, Jagdpanthers executed several highly effective ambushes, destroying dozens of Allied tanks in rapid succession, only to later be found abandoned and burned or blown up by their own crews. The biggest enemy of the Jagdpanther was the deteriorating situation of the German army. They suffered from fuel and ammunition shortages, frequent mechanical breakdowns, and a lack of spare parts or the ability to repair them in the field. Although some claimed the Jagdpanther was unreliable, experienced crews loved it and argued that its mechanical failures were mostly due to inexperienced and poorly trained drivers who caused damage to the engine and transmission, which then couldn't be repaired. An interesting side note is that loaders were quite often injured in Jagdpanthers for some reason. When the gun was fired, the breech recoiled back significantly and could crush anything in its way, and sometimes that was the loader's leg or hand. But this was also probably due to poor training later in the war. On the Eastern Front, it was even worse. The Germans had to destroy everything they couldn't bring with them so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands, and Jagdpanthers were no exception. They fought with only a couple of shells and on a nearly empty gas tank. For example, the 563rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 53 Soviet tanks in one battle, only to be forced to blow up 12 of their Jagdpanthers that either broke down or ran out of fuel. In another instance, a lone Jagdpanther held back an entire Soviet armored column, destroying 12 tanks, until the crew ran out of fuel and ammunition and was forced to abandon and burn down their vehicle. The same happened in battles against the American and British armies in Western Europe, as seen in the Battle of the Bulge, where only a small portion of Jagdpanthers were actually destroyed by the Allies. They would cause severe damage and fight as long as they could, but the outcome was usually the same. A few Jagdpanthers were captured intact when their crews failed to destroy them, and the Allies were fascinated by their design. After the war, in captured factories, around a dozen Jagdpanthers were built under the supervision of Royal Engineers and shipped to England for evaluation. Some of their features were later incorporated into new Allied tanks, such as the Centurion and M48 pattern. One of these Jagdpanthers survived and is displayed at the Bovington Tank Museum. Post-war advancements in tank technology and the main battle tank concept led to the abandonment of turretless tank destroyers. Tanks with turrets could now take on the roles of light, medium, and heavy tanks, as well as tank destroyers, all in a single vehicle. Today, only 10 Jagdpanthers still exist, with 4 restored to running condition and displayed in museums across Europe.